And that's that first step in boundary setting is awareness, listening to yourself. It's an enormous superpower in leadership, in business, and in your personal life. Hello, and welcome to the Business of Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tarryn MacCarthy, and today's going to be a great day. It's going to be an uncomfortable day, but it's going to be great because we're going to learn some great new skills on boundary setting. Setting boundaries is one of those skills in life that can just elevate you to the next level, or if you choose to ignore the opportunity, can really hinder you and leave you frustrated, resentful, and disempowered. So boundary setting is critical. It's something that I've learned in my life to do, and it doesn't make it easier to continue to practice setting boundaries. Setting boundaries is always uncomfortable. In fact, that's one of the greatest misconceptions. But it's also the only way to elevate yourself personally or professionally. I'm going to start us out today with a quote by Brené Brown. And you all know how much I love Brené Brown. Brené Brown has given me so much insight into the business aspect of my life. But so much of what she says can also be translated into our personal lives. And just hear this quote. When we fail to set boundaries and hold people accountable, we feel used and mistreated. And I love that quote because it immediately establishes the importance of boundary setting, not just for self-preservation, which is absolutely critical, but also recognize that when you don't set clear boundaries, it actually muddies the relationship. You start resenting somebody. You start feeling negative emotions toward them because you haven't been clear about that boundary, or perhaps you've never even established it for yourself. The thing about boundaries is we need to continually revisit them because throughout our lives, we are growing and changing and new boundaries need to be put in place. Here's an example. And I think many of my entrepreneur listeners will understand this. When you start a business from scratch, you wear all the hats all the time. In fact, many entrepreneurs know that you are doing the job 7 days a week just to get it off the ground. This was very true for me when I started my orthodontic practice from scratch 5 years ago. I was working 7 days a week. It was that season of my life where I just was pouring everything into my dream, and I needed to. Now, I wasn't yet making $1, so I needed to be the receptionist, the orthodontist, the contractor who was fixing things in the back, the coordinator of all the construction, the GM, if you will, the GC or GM, whatever term you are familiar with, but literally coordinating all the things happening to build this practice and then to start creating the platform for patients to be able to schedule appointments, and then to actually see the patients, and then to sterilize the equipment, and then to call and remind patients. I mean, literally wearing all the hats. So then as you start growing your business, the more successful you are, the more you realize, I need some help here. I can't wear all these hats all the time. Now I'm going to need some reinforcement. So you start hiring people. And immediately when you hire someone and establish their job description, you're already creating boundaries. Creating boundaries for yourself and boundaries for your employee. That's all it is. As we go through life and as we assume new responsibilities, as we grow into higher versions of ourselves, we just need to take a look and establish some new boundaries. And it's when we don't establish those boundaries when we start to fall apart. And that's one of the first clues that you need to set boundaries, is when you find yourself broken, exhausted, burning the candle at both ends, all those terms, overwhelmed, even, dare I say, resentful. When you start feeling these negative emotions, ask yourself, wait a minute, do I need to set some boundaries here? And what I'd love for us when we're talking about boundaries today is to look at it from a lens of compassion. not a lens of anger or reinforcement or demanding or isolation. I mean, that's what I think most of us think about when we think about boundaries. We think, oh man, now some discomfort's going to happen. And it's true, some emotions are going to come out when you start changing the rules of the game with people around you. Absolutely. One of the biggest fallacies about boundaries is that everyone's just going to understand. I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and say almost no one's going to understand. Only you are going to understand. But it's still your responsibility to reinforce them. But if we look at boundaries from a lens of compassion from the very beginning, we can see how powerful, empowering, and compassionate boundary setting can be. Because boundaries are clarity. And anytime we can add clarity to a relationship, now we know the rules of the game. Hey, I can do anything you need me to as long as I know what the rules are. But if you change your mind one day and sometimes you feel angry or resentful when we keep doing things the same way we've always been doing them, I get confused. So will your employees. So will the people you love. If you're 1 minute okay with a behavior and the next minute resentful and uncomfortable or angry, that feels unsafe and unreliable. And of course, things start to break down. So actually, boundary setting is enormously compassionate and enormously empowering. And they start with you. Boundaries are only established by you. Only you can enforce them. And only you can understand them truly. Now, that's an interesting thing because many people say, I've set up this boundary and she's not honoring my boundaries. And we tend to get really frustrated and resentful about people who don't, quote unquote, honor our boundaries. But actually, that responsibility lies with you. Sometimes people won't understand, or they'll feel confused, or sometimes they're just trying to express their love in the only way that they know how, or maybe they're just trying to cope. I really believe that most of us don't wake up in the morning thinking, I'm going to be a jerk today. I really believe that. I really believe we're all just trying to do our best on a daily basis. And sometimes we just don't have the tools to do that in a kind way. But really, it's not a malicious way from an intent from the time you wake up in the morning. So don't just assume that because somebody's not honoring your boundaries, it's because they are out to get you. It's perhaps they just don't know another way to be. Still your responsibility to reinforce them, but maybe look at it from a lens of compassion or at the very least curiosity. I was just out in Wyoming this last week and we were seeing it's great cattle country and huge farms, and they have these lots and lots of wildlife. I mean, it was amazing. We saw bison and coyote and moose and enormous, huge animals. And wild animals don't know boundaries. So what the farmers do, what the ranchers do is they build fences. And they've got these huge fences. But as you're driving through the country on any day, you'll notice that they're constantly maintaining these fences. The boundaries that they've had to establish to protect their cattle, to protect their livestock from the wildlife around them, and to protect the wildlife from their cattle, has to constantly be reinforced and maintained. It's not resentment for the cattle if somebody breaks through the fence or the gate that they've established. Sometimes a cow is spooked and they jump and they break down a fence. Or sometimes the natural instincts of a wild animal is to just burrow underneath or get through somehow. It's nature. Those boundaries will be intercepted, will be broken down. And still, it's the rancher or the farmer's responsibility to go back in and fix it up again. So just think of it in that regard, is that any boundaries that are worth setting are worth maintaining as well. And it really is our personal responsibility to do so. Not the coyotes, not the cows, but our own, as understanding why they're there in place in the first place. So what I've done is I've created a 4-step process, because sometimes I hear from my clients that they're not sure when it's appropriate to establish a boundary. Like sometimes our emotions cloud our judgment about when we should or shouldn't set up a boundary. So I've established this 4-step process that you can use to understand about boundaries and then how to reinforce them. And it starts, number 1, with awareness. Awareness is one of those things where you're just checking in with your feelings, checking in with your emotions, checking in with how you feel physically and emotionally. And this is one of those practices I really think is critical in self-care, is just listening to your body, listening to your heart rate, listening to your breathing, listening to your emotional state, listening to your bandwidth. Are you just getting to the end of the day and you've got nothing left? If someone spills something on the floor, are you exploding? If a team member does one little mistake in the office, are you flying off the handle? If you have very short temper and bandwidth, then it's a clear indicator, a red flag that there need to be some boundaries. Another way to recognize is resentment. I spoke about this earlier, but if you find that you're beginning to resent your mother-in-law for something, time for clear boundaries. If you find that you're beginning to resent one of your team members, time for clear boundaries, time for clarity. So just being fully aware. And as I mentioned earlier, I want us to imagine this from the place of compassion. So have enormous compassion for yourself in this moment. When you recognize, wow, this is something that's setting me off and triggering me, be compassionate towards yourself. I like the phrase, because I am weak, I am strong. I've used that in my life before for setting boundaries for myself. Alcohol was one of those things for me, because I found that I just couldn't sometimes have something to drink and sometimes not have something to drink. Because I am weak, I'm strong. I had to create a clear boundary for myself. Tarryn, no more alcohol. Now, I know other people can tolerate it. Other people can most definitely enjoy a glass of wine with friends, enjoy an occasional martini. And for them, they're able to. That's in their ability to tolerate and not go over the edge. For me, it wasn't. For me, it was very clear that because I am weak, I am strong. And that actually made me feel more empowered. It created clear guidelines for myself. The rules were easy to follow. I just never drink alcohol. For me, that works. But the same is true for responsibilities at work. Is it possible to maintain wearing all the hats all the time as a business owner as you're getting more clientele, more patients? No. Now your responsibilities shift to standing more in the doctor position. Now you need to do the doctor things and let other professionals do the accounting things, the bill paying things, the scheduling things, and you need to stay back into your wheelhouse of where you do things really well. Compassion for yourself. Sometimes we have this unrealistic expectation that we should be able to do so much more. And the reality is, it's not being super responsible. So the 3 questions you can ask yourself in this awareness step, this step number 1 is it compassionate? Primarily to myself. Is this making me feel good? And I know sometimes we feel uncomfortable with that, but really ask yourself, how do I feel? Getting in touch with how you feel really matters. Does this make me feel great, or does this make me feel terrible? And number 2, is it sustainable? If nothing else were to change, could I keep doing this for the next year, for the next 10 years? And then number 3, is it responsible? As the doctor in this practice, is it responsible for me to take time away from my patients to be updating QuickBooks? Is that responsible? Maybe it is for you in your situation, but that's the question. If you ask yourself those 3 questions, is it compassionate to me? Is it sustainable? And is it responsible? If you get a no to any of those questions, then it's clear it's time to establish some boundaries. What we need right now is to leverage happiness in the workplace. If you're a leader or manager struggling with retaining team members and frustrated with the current staffing shortage, group coaching for your team is your solution. Christina Unrein and I have partnered together to build a 10-week group coaching workshop for your business, focused directly on increasing happiness and positivity in the workplace. How do we do this? We use the awesome systems you already have in place and support your team members directly with tools for a mindset shift for awareness of their individual power to own their own happiness. Learn how to cultivate accountability for happiness in your team members and guide them with the tools to own their empowerment at work. Turning around workplace culture starts with individuals, and Christina and I are here for you. Email me at tarryn@thebizofhappiness.com if you are ready to make workplace happiness your competitive advantage. So, from my own experience in my life, this happened in a very real way. And I'm using this example because it was extremely emotional. Because when we start looking at boundaries, we tell ourselves these stories that feel very close to our hearts and to our emotions. And that's what makes it more difficult to act on our boundary setting. A few years ago, a family member was having a lot of trouble and had attempted taking her own life several times. It was extremely emotional. For me, that's very difficult. I love her. I want to be there to help her. I want to be there for support. So, of course, every time something like this happened, I would throw everything up in my personal life and hop on a plane to be down there to support and to sustain her situation and to somehow bail her out of what she was in. That meant my kids had to be suddenly upended in their routine. My husband had to be upended in his routine. My practice, my orthodontic practice, I had to suddenly find support for my patients who were scheduled. I had my whole life had to go on hold every time this extended family member had a crisis. It became extremely difficult to sustain because it was happening over and over again. The first question, is this compassionate towards me? I was losing my mind. I was not able to maintain everything all the time. I couldn't be a available mom. I couldn't be an available wife. I couldn't be an available orthodontist or business owner. I had to throw my own life up in the air every time this was happening. The second question, was it sustainable? Absolutely not. Things were starting to fall apart on the home front for me, most significantly with my kids. That's where I noticed it worst. I noticed the biggest impact on the people who mattered most to me. And that brought me to the third question, is this responsible? I have a certain responsibility to my children primarily, and I had to start setting some clear boundaries. But can you see how all my old stories started coming in and clouding up that lens on my compass, where it said, oh, but I need to take care of this person. I'm the one person who can. I'm so capable. And high achieving men and women get this all the time because guess what? You can. You are so capable. But the question is it sustainable and is it responsible? And I had to be very clear on some boundaries. And that brings me to the third step, and that is stating it. So stating it sometimes needs to happen with clarity to the other person, but sometimes just stating it for yourself is all you need to do. Establishing that boundary with clarity in your own mind, and I say out loud or written down, so that it's very clear to you the new rules of the game. Sometimes it means a conversation. Always it means a conversation when it's in business, because clarity is so important in business. I can understand some personal situations where it might not be appropriate for you to lean in and explain the new boundaries, but Many times, it's so much more compassionate to do so. So you can have a conversation and it doesn't come as a surprise when all of a sudden Tarryn doesn't show up when she always has. That feels scary. That feels neglectful. But when you can have a conversation where you can say, this is my reasoning, this is my understanding, and this is where I need to have responsibility for my family and for myself. And please know, these are the areas I'm so willing to help you with. Let's find you some support. Let's find some other resources. I'm not any less compassionate towards you. I just need to create some clear boundaries to take care of myself and my world as well. So important to do in business. Remember that business owner who started out wearing all the hats and then needed to hire some people to take responsibility? Even after you've hired a few people, or maybe you've hired 10 or 12 or 15 people, and now everyone has new responsibilities, there are still going to be additional levels of growth in your business where you're going to have to establish new boundaries. Here's another example for you. In my business, at one point, I was seeing patients at very liberal hours, even as late as 6 o'clock. That was important at that time in my growth for me to be able to see patients all the way through the day. But there became a very clear boundary setting that needed to happen as a responsible, strategic move for my own health and availability to my family and for my teams. We decided that on a certain day we were going to end at 4 o'clock. Now, one of the misconceptions I alluded to earlier is that other people are just going to understand your boundaries. Nope. In fact, the opposite is true. When you establish boundaries, be very prepared for people to be upset. Not because they're bad people, just because the rules have changed and maybe they don't understand, or maybe this was an important part of making it work, of coping in their lives. They were relying on you in that old place. Imagine your orthodontist said to you, all of a sudden, I'm stopping seeing patients at 4 o'clock, and you needed that 5 o'clock appointment because that's when you got out of work. Of course you were going to be upset. Does it mean that she shouldn't have set the boundaries? Absolutely not. The boundaries are still maintained. And this is where supporting your team is so important, especially when you're creating new protocol for your business. Did we lose one patient for this change in our schedule? Nope. Did we lose $1 in our production because of this change in our schedule? Nope. Did we create some discomfort and some resentment and some difficult conversations? Absolutely. Not because they're bad people, but because they don't necessarily have the reasoning or the understanding of why the boundaries are being set. But setting the boundaries is important and empowering. It is compassionate, it is sustainable, and it is responsible. Going back to those 3 questions. Especially in personal relationships, you might bring up quite a bit of discomfort. There might be some uncomfortable conversations, but just leaning into compassion for the other person in that moment is so important as well. Oh, I see why this is uncomfortable for you. You've always known our relationship in a different way, and now I'm creating some boundaries. Perhaps it's a sister who every time she texts you, she expects you to respond right away. And she's been relying on that for years. In fact, you've established that relationship over decades maybe. And now it's become very clear to you that that's interrupting your life with your children. It's taking you away from presence in the moment that you're really working on to increase your happiness. Perhaps it's distracting you from taking care of your patients or your clientele or being in a meeting. And now you need some new rules with your sister. Having that conversation is so important. And then understanding that she might be a little bit angry at first. But I promise you that the new rules, the new boundaries are going to be so much more rewarding in the long term. Maybe there'll be a little difficulty for an interim in that relationship, But once we establish a new pattern of interaction, and then the most critical part is the step number 4, maintaining it. Especially children get so uncomfortable and confused when we set rules, and then we sometimes bend them, and sometimes we enforce them. When we can be more clear in terms of the maintenance of those boundaries, people feel safer. People feel like they know what to expect. Sometimes it takes a little while for us to get to that place where we fully understand. And for your sister to then realize you still love her, you'll still respond, but you're not going to respond immediately. But then maybe you, when you see that text, put the phone down for a heartbeat, wait an hour, maybe wait a day. Reinforcing those boundaries is so important. And then with all the compassion in the world, I'm here for you. How can I help you? I just had to set that boundary so that I could be there for you in a better place, be more present with you so that I'm not distracted by 100 other things. Do you see the compassion that comes in that moment? In terms of business as well, having that negative feedback from team members can also make you question your boundary setting, because perhaps they've been used to one thing in the past and now they have to learn some new skills and new training in order to take on the responsibility and the accountability for their new expectations. So be compassionate and give them time. But the most important thing is to maintain those boundaries so that they can have an understanding and have time to get to that new place where they know how to operate in that new place. I'll give you an example here in business. A client of mine has this incredible business. She's such a great business owner. She's such a great leader. She has led her team to enormous success. But up until now, on her day off, she has been answering the phone or texts from the office at any point during the day. And this has become clear that it's robbing her of her recovery and refueling on her day off. And it's also distracting her from other responsibilities she needs to pay attention to on that day. So she's had to establish a new boundary with her team. On my days off, I will not respond to calls or to texts. And here's how she then followed it up with her team. Guys, I have so much faith and trust in you. I know you can do this. This is me showing you how much I value you and your expertise. Now, has there been some kickback? Absolutely. Has it been difficult? Absolutely. They've had to learn some new skills and grow in their ability as well. And of course they're uncomfortable with this. They were relying on just texting her at any time on the day off. But maintaining those boundaries and being clear not to respond is so critical because it takes time. It takes time. So having that compassion is so critical. I'll leave you with this last quote. It's from Marianne Williamson, and I love it because she says, "No one will listen until we listen to ourselves." And that's that first step in boundary setting is awareness, listening to yourself. It's an enormous superpower in leadership, in business, and in your personal life. So let me be the first one to give you permission. Here's all the permission you need, my incredible friends, to set those boundaries with love and compassion. And always remember to ask yourself those 3 questions. Is this compassionate? Is it sustainable? And is it responsible? Have a fabulous rest of the week. And I'm so excited to be speaking to you next week. There's some great interviews next week I cannot wait to share with you. And until then, remember, it's when you feel good that you do good. Bye-bye.